Hey everyone, please take the time to write down your essential questions so that you can write out the answers to help you learn better. Well, Chapter 10, Citizen Belief and Public Opinion Polls. We're looking at what are polls? Why do we use polls? How do we create polls? Everything about polls and the government. Are you a conservative or are you a liberal? Remember on day one, we did the assignment on which way we sat. We did some political thing talking about where everybody is. Now, political culture, that's our attitudes. That's how we shape. That's how we decide what we are. Cornerstones of our political culture, folks, the individualism, the bootstrap concept. Everyone has equal opportunity. Free enterprise, capitalism, rule of law. Everyone should be treated the same in the law. And of course, limited government is very important. Individualism, folks, everybody matters. Everybody has worth. Everyone is important. Our Bill of Rights protects our individual, inalienable rights. But we have to balance that with self-interest. What I believe is important may not be different than what the group believes important. So that's always a balancing act when it comes to the individualism in this country. Equal opportunity, of course. Everyone has a right to try to get rich. Not everybody will, but everyone has a right to try. And the 14th Amendment codified the concept of no one may be denied any equal protection of the laws at the state level, not just the Bill of Rights at the federal level. Free enterprise, of course, we are considered a capitalist system, even though we're more of a mixed system. But our government is not a command economy. We take more of a laissez-faire or let-it-be approach. Adam Smith and his invisible hand. He believed the best way that the economy would thrive is if government only intervenes very, very little. He wanted government to, maintain the country's law and order, but businesses should be dealing with economics. And if you look rule of law, 5 things. Okay, laws better be transparent, predictable, stable, enforceable, and that due process involves everything we do. And finally, limited government, folks. Government needs to be kept under control by both checks and balances, separation of powers, both federalism, separation of powers at the federal level. Everything is our key to our civil liberties if our government is limited. Balance issues versus wedge issues, folks. Balance issues concern policies that are viewed the same way by a variety of ideologies. Everyone believes that government should regulate dangerous industries. How we regulate them are, the minor issues. Same thing with public education, free speech. Wedge issues, those are the ones that sharply divide us. One group believes this, one group believes that. Wars, one group says yes, one group says no. So understand the difference between what we all believe in, just not how we get there, and what people have different drastic ideas. There's your liberal versus conservative, folks. Basic look at the differences in what people believe in on either side of the spectrum. Just to understand, a majority of people are right here in the middle between them. If you look at ideology and how it's changed, it really hasn't changed much. Okay, moderates, conservatives, even the liberals, everyone's kind of been even along the line as we've been going on. Now, if you look at ideology, you can see that the moderates pretty stayed, 43 down to 35 kind of thing. Conservatives, they've gone up and down and they're still about the same. And a slow, very, very slow, steady increase of the liberal ideology since 1992. They're all getting to be, it's a third kind of thing. Libertarians, of course, outside of the liberal and conservative, although most libertarians do have an R behind their names if they're running for office, but they don't want government intervention or regulation in hardly anything. They would be very pro drugs and pro business, pro prostitution, pro anything that isn't government regulation. They think the Bill of Rights is all king, high regard for civil liberties, conservative fiscally. They don't want government spending any money, but they're also very liberal socially when it comes to all of those sin ideas of prostitution and drugs and things like that. Oppose censorship completely, would like taxes to be as low as possible. Any government imposed morality is bad to a libertarian. Populists are all about working class families, Protestant, fundamental Christians, South and Midwest. Donald Trump appealed to the populist views when he ran for office in 2016. Progressives, they were Republicans. Early 1900s. The progressives of the 1900s are the liberals of today, which is why Teddy Roosevelt split off from them. The progressives and the conservatives emerged as two different parties, workers' rights over corporate rights. The progressives believe the wealthy should pay more tax than the poor. That's the progressive tax structure we have today, comes from them. Biggest influences on political socialization, folks. Family is number one. This is your biggest influence on what you're going to be later in life. Your teachers, your peers come next. Media has a tendency to weaken family influence. Religious institutions, it depends which one you are. I mean, Republicans have a tendency to be Protestants, Catholic and Jews, tendency to favor the Democratic Party. Civic institutions, non-governmental, non-business, voluntary sector. Hey, and where you live is a big influence on what you're going to be. People in the South were Democrats. Now they are Republicans as you go by. The influence of globalization in this ever-expanding, increasingly, close world, everything influences political culture, folks. U.S. influence on the world is seen as democratizing, but it also heightens tensions when you have American Western values going into areas. This is where we get our conflicts with the Middle East and things like that. Other countries beginning to influence the U.S. through globalization. The concept of the collectivist culture in Asia comes from let's work together idea is starting to come toward the United States. Generational effects, folks, 4 generational categories that we look at. Okay, silent generation is almost gone. That was World War II and before. The people who fought the war, the baby boomers, of course, were born from the silent generation. I am a baby boomer. I am the last year of the baby boomers. Generation X up to 1982, and then you millennials, and then, of course, we're going to add the Gen Zs in there as we're going along. Now, the millennials, if you can look at their views, foreign policy, economic, and voting, you can see millennials much more head toward the Democratic side than the Republican side, while the silent generation was much more Republican than, say, the voters of the younger generations. Silent generation was all about defeating communism, whereas the modern era, they don't even, understand what communism is, kind of thing. Now, when we're looking at specific about polling, folks, you're trying to gather information. You want to know what people think so you can target ads, target campaign strategies. Candidates will do this before they've even declared whether they're running for office to kind of get a look at what people are looking for. Populists have a tendency to do that. This is what the people want, so this is what I'm going to tell them. Okay? A lot of polling companies use tracking questions. We always ask, what's the president's approval? Do you approve of the president's job? And they will track that question monthly, kind of thing. And that's where you see the president's poll numbers that are always reported. Those are those tracking questions. Marijuana has been a tracking question since like the 1960s. It finally broke the 50% mark a couple years back. Exit polling, of course, taken outside polling places. This is really considered, in the last few elections, highly suspect in its ability to judge how an election is going to turn. Many exit polls in 2016 showed Hillary Clinton winning the election, and of course, that didn't happen. They're trying to predict the outcome of the election by what people are telling them as they leave. People lie. People can vote for one person and say, I voted for another, to try to screw it. You're trying to gain insight. You're trying to identify, and analyze what people are voting for. Polling methodology, you've got to be real specific, folks. You have to be very objective and non-biased when you're wording of questions. Any bias is going to skew your results. The question order can skew results, and framing it. Just simple ways to look at it can be a problem. All right, sampling techniques. If you want a good poll, you need to make sure you have a representative sample, which means everyone has a chance to be chosen. You want about 1,500. 1,500 gives you a plus or minus of about 3% when you're talking error. So your goal is to get a representative sample. That representative sample, should be random. Everyone has an equal chance to be part of this sample. Companies have created this random digit sample, so phone numbers are randomly selected and called by computer, and their goal is to try to get 1,500, but it's all done very randomly as it goes along. And you also need to look at weighting. If your demographics, if you're asking a question and you don't have the same demographic as the general population, your poll might be off too. It can be a very difficult situation. Sampling error, folks. The larger the sample, the smaller margin, but the larger the sample, the more expensive a poll is to run. You're trying to look for 4%, 3%, and that's where that 1,500 comes in. Sampling error, folks. If you're within the sampling error, the plus or minus, the margin of error, you're in a dead heat. It's really hard to tell because they can go, it's like an 8-point difference, 6-point difference. Push polling, folks, these are biased. If I tell you that, if you knew that, my opponent killed kittens, would you vote for them? That's a push poll. The only thing you heard was my opponent kills kittens. You want to make sure you push a person answering the poll, giving it negative. And so push polling is considered a bad poll. You don't ever want to use those for the bias that it is. Public opinion, where do we get it from? Well, bandwagon effect. If anybody ever watched the Cubs win the World Series, all of a sudden there were tons and tons of Cubs fans. Everybody hated them prior to winning the World Series. Then all of a sudden everybody shifts. Once Joe Biden won all those Super Tuesday states, everyone started jumping on the Joe Biden bandwagon, and Bernie Sanders started losing supporters. It'll probably be the same in the next set of elections coming on, I'm not sure what date, the 4th. Maybe there's some before that. But that's your bandwagon effect. Right now, Joe Biden is running that as far as he can. Influence on the policy debate, legislative, executive, judicial. You're going to always have issues with public opinion. The legislative branch, of course, the reps are very responsive. They get voted every 2 years, so they have to be really right on top of what public opinion is. Senators, they have 6 years, not so much, not much of a problem. The executive normally has that 100-day honeymoon period when they just got elected. Everyone loves them, so they can try to get their agenda advanced. After that, it kind of drops off. President Trump, folks, he had a below high ranking. I mean, his poll was lower when he started. He's never really had a high policy or a high public opinion, so he's had a harder time. Judicial, don't say that the judicial isn't immune to or is immune to public opinion. They're not. When Brown versus Board of Education was passed, there was already rumblings about segregation in the country. They weren't the first to be looking at that when they issued Brown v. Board in '54. they do look at public opinion. It is kind of an influential thing to all three branches of government. Social desirability bias, folks. Respondents and declared voters tell the pollster what they think the pollster wants to hear. When a pollster asks a question, you're in your brain, you're thinking that. It can affect predictions of voter turnout. Everybody wants to say, I'm going to vote. Not everybody's going to vote, but everybody says they're going to vote. Because voters don't want to be perceived negatively. They don't want to say, oh, I'm not going to vote. So they're going to say they're going to vote. Whether they do or not is an entirely different story. Undecideds generally break very late or go vote very late or decide very late. They don't answer a lot of polls, so it's very difficult to figure out which way they're going to go at the very end. I know people who walk into the voting booth and still don't know who they're going to vote for. They're very undecided. Voters will turn away from pollsters. I'm like, I'm not answering your questions. Don't want to be involved. It happens. Are there any questions? If there are, please send me an email or put a comment up on Google Classroom. What is political culture? The cornerstones. Please know your difference between the valance and the wedge issue. Liberals and conservatives, understand those differences. No, liberal, populist, progressive, libertarian, should add libertarian in on number 4. Liberals. Understand political socialization. Family is your biggest factor. Know those 4 generationals and the effects that happen to those generations. Know how to make a good poll with random samples and non-biased questions. And the most important thing is knowing that political opinions matter. Politicians take them into account when they're forming policies, so you really need to understand that. Thank you very much. Any questions, just send them on over.